Hi, it's Sarah with Designs by Sarah J. Welcome back to Swivel, the 2020 Quiltmania Mystery Project. We're ready to dive into installment 2, and I want to share my tips and tricks with you on how to make the blocks for this installment. Gather up your fabrics. If you participated last month with one of the mystery shops, then you'll want to locate your fabric 5, which was the shirting print, and the yardage of fabric 6, which is the dark gray, so be sure that you have those on hand. Then your kits this month from participating shops will have included this selection. You should have this great red viney stripe. This has so much fussy cutting opportunity and movement. It's one of my favorite pieces in the full circle line. You'll also have received 2 purples. Notice that this one is a stripe, so again, lots of fussy cutting opportunity if you enjoy adding that kind of detail to your quilt. You'll have 2 greens, a light green and a dark green, and then also you'll have a gold that has accents of green, so it ties the pieces together in these blocks. You should have also located the templates that you plan to use. You can either trace the templates in the magazine, or there are acrylic templates available. And this installment's acrylic set includes 3 pieces. They're available with either 1/4 inch seams or 3/8 inch seams. The blocks this month can be made in your choice of technique. So if you enjoy hand piecing, you can definitely do that. This is a fantastic slow stitch project. If you like rotary cutting and machine piecing, then the acrylics do have 1/4 inch seam lines, and they also have alignment holes, so you can mark little dots on the fabric to make sure that your points line up, and I'm going to show you how I do that later in this video. And then the acrylics also come in a 3/8 inch seam version, so if you enjoy English paper piecing, you can definitely pick those up, and paper packs are available to help you make the blocks. So be sure to check with your participating shop about those add-ons. Finally, if you picked up the Aurifil thread set that accompanies my full circle line, this is a great installment to try out some of the threads. As I mentioned last installment, the set includes 2 of my favorite grays for machine piecing. Color 2615 and 2625 are my go-to grays. And then if you've never tried the 80 weight thread and you're going to do hand piecing or English paper piecing, then I really encourage you to try out one of these shades this month. Color 2620 is a great medium to light gray, and color 2310 is a creamy white. The 80 weight thread is really strong, but it's so fine that your stitches just disappear. And if you're like me, sometimes when I try English paper piecing, I just worry about those stitches showing on top. It will not with the 80 weight thread. I've had so much success with that, so I encourage you to give it a try. So we're going to get started cutting the blocks this month. Gather all your materials, and then let's dive in. Okay, we're back and we're ready to start cutting out the first block of installment 2. I've got my B1 template, which is the first one that I'm going to use, and you can see that I've put some of the True Grip adhesives on the back to make sure that it won't slip on the fabric as I'm cutting. With this particular shape, B1, you can see that there are 2 long sides that are the same length, and they're joined by a shorter triangle. And that's important if you recall from installment 1 that anytime a triangle has 2 sides that are equal length, it doesn't matter if you lay the template right side up or wrong side where the words look backward. With this purple print, which is the first fabric that we're cutting, you can choose to fussy cut and try to line up the circles, maybe put one of the orange circles right in the tip between the seam lines, or this is a print too where I would consider layering it and cutting all 4 of my shapes at once if I was rotary cutting for machine piecing. If you're hand piecing, then it's certainly fine to draw them out and fussy cut, but if you're looking for a little more speed, you could layer. The other purple print that we will cut this same shape from is the purple stripe. And with this piece, I would take the time to cut the shapes individually because we don't want our triangle to be laying on there and have the stripe wonky. That's going to disrupt the flow of the block. This purple print, the stripe, actually appears in both blocks this month. And so for this particular block, I chose to line it up so the short side of the triangle was parallel to one of the seam or the stripe lines. So the stripe's running horizontally across the shape. For the other block, I actually turned it so that the stripe was running vertically. So pay attention to which block you use the stripe in if you want to line it up similarly to how I did. So I'm going to line these pieces up, cut the shapes out, and I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about adding marking holes to the dark purple. Your acrylic templates, if you have them, or if you've made your own templates, you need to have the ability to mark where the intersections of the 1/4 inch seam are going to occur. This is really important for creating the Y seam if you are doing machine piecing of this block. If you're doing EPP or hand piecing, then you're automatically going to have those points available with your construction. But for machine piecing, it's important I know where the 1/4 inch seam intersection occurs. So I've got these dots or little holes in my templates. And I'm going to take a marking pen. Any kind of a marking pen that you like to use is fine. You could use a mechanical pencil. Some days I do that. Some days I like just a Sharpie. I know that's a little untraditional, but a Sharpie works well for me. Certainly other fabric marking tools that you're comfortable with are great. So my big tip on marking alignment holes for any kind of piecing is make sure you're holding your pen vertically. If you tilt the pen, even though that hole is pretty small, you're going to get the dot just a little bit off of true center. And because there are so many seams in these blocks, even if you're off just by a 32nd of an inch, it wouldn't be hard to get across the entire block off by up to a 1/4 inch if you're not being accurate. So I'm going to hold the pen straight up and down, and then I'm just going to lightly twirl it, and that will create the mark that I need. I'm going to do that at all 3 corners, just so I have these shapes marked. And I'll repeat that for all 4 of my dark triangles so that I know, because they're the ones that are going to be intersecting with that Y seam that's coming up later in the block. As I mentioned, I cut out the other B1 shape from the stripe so that the stripe was running horizontal to the short side of the block. You're also going to be cutting the B2 shape from your shirting print. This is a standard triangle with 2 equal sides, so there's nothing really tricky about this shape. The other shape that this month you're using that does need to pay attention to the side because it does have a reverse is B3. And this shape is really similar to A4 from last month, but you have one very long side and then a short side where the triangle lines come together, and then you have this is a hypotenuse if you had geometry back in the day and remember that, and these are your 2 right angle sides. So with the B3 shape, you're cutting the greens for the first block with this, and it does make a difference which way that triangle lays. And what I like to do to make sure that I'm doing this correctly is I would get out my magazine and I would look at this shape. And so here is the B3 shape, and I would lay this triangle so that I'm seeing how it appears in the magazine. And so I can see that the dark green, the triangle is actually, the template shape is upside down, so it's reversed. And the light, I can see that is the correct, where I can read the words on the template, way that one lays out. So that tells me that for the light green fabric, I'm going to want to cut this so that the fabric's facing upright and I can read the words on the template, and I'll cut my 4 shapes across. And then for the dark green fabric, I'm going to want to have the template upside down where the words are backwards to me. And then that will put these 2 shapes in alignment so that I've got the right triangles going the right direction. Now, worst case, if you get confused on this and you've cut these the opposite way of what I've shown, it won't make a big difference in your block. It's okay if the light green and the dark green are reversed in your construction. So if you make a mistake, don't panic. It's really not going to affect anything. But if you want to make it just like the magazine, pay attention to that. So go ahead and cut your shapes, and then we'll talk about double checking to make sure everything's okay, and then we'll start sewing. Okay, we've now cut out all the shapes for the first block in installment 2. And what I always like to do at this point is lay everything out and make sure I'm happy with how I've cut everything and that I've followed the directions. And I do that anytime I've got a block that's using reverse elements so that I'm sure that I've cut that correctly. And with this block, we cut the green, the light green B3 upright, and then we reverse that template and cut the dark green. And then just like in the blocks from installment 1, we've got the A4 shape around the outer edge of this block. And you can see that we've cut both A4 upright and A4 reverse. Because this is a print that doesn't have any obvious directionality, I could layer that piece when I cut it. So that's something, if you're looking for a little time saver, anytime you've got a print without obvious directionality, you can certainly do that. So everything looks good here, and now is when I would pause to say, how am I going to start piecing these elements together? And if I didn't have directions telling me how to do it, I would take a look and think, what are the smaller elements that I can join first to then have them fit onto the longer elements? And what I like to do, similar to what I showed you in installment 1, is cover up part of the block so I'm only looking at a smaller segment. And I know that from the first installment, I was able to make 4 small squares and join them, so that's going to be my starting point here again. You can see that I could join these triangles and add here, and then I'd have wedges that I could make into a square and add this. With that approach, I am going to have a Y seam here. There's really no way to avoid it. And I studied this block a lot. That is going to be the easiest way to construct this block. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the 2 purple triangles together and add the shirting triangle to it. Now, I do notice that this is where that Y seam is going to occur. And so I marked the alignment dot on the back of this, and I'm going to want to go ahead and mark alignment dots on the back of the B2 shirting triangle. And that's because ultimately I'm not going to stitch all the way to the edge of this piece. I'm going to take a hand piecing approach, even though I'm using the machine, and only stitch to the alignment dot. So go ahead and pause and mark your alignment dots if you're machine piecing on the back of the 8 shirting triangles, and then I'll stitch the first part of this and show you what it should look like. Okay, we are back, and as you can see, I've gone ahead and I've sewn the 2 triangles from the B1 shape, the dark purple and the light purple, together along the short edge. And then I've started adding the B2 shirting triangle to each side of the darker purple piece. And this is the important point. Remember, I said we needed to mark the alignment holes on these pieces so that we could take a hand piecing approach even if we're machine stitching. And hopefully you can see this. What I did was I dropped the needle in, and I inserted a still photo in this video so you can see how I did that. But I dropped the needle in exactly on that alignment hole so that I'm starting stitching right there. And I stitched forward 2 to 3 stitches and then used the reverse function on my machine and stitched backward, and then I went ahead and stitched the rest of that seam line. I'm using a stitch length of about 2.0. That's going to give me a nice tight stitch because I will be putting a lot of pressure on this as I'm making that Y seam there. And then it's time to press this. Now with this, you can certainly press open if that's your preference. For myself, I tend to press toward one side, and I'm going to go ahead and press this toward the dark. And you can see what I do first is press that gently with my finger so the seam's going the right way. And then I'm going to lay the iron just on top of that and give it a brief press. Avoid sewing or moving the iron back and forth with a seesaw motion just press the iron on there gently to set that seam because you don't want to distort the piece. So I've got my 4 pieces now that I've added the first triangle on one side. I'm going to go ahead and come back and add the other triangle, and then I'll show you what the next steps are so we can finish this first block of installment 2. Okay, we're back, and as you can see, we have sewn the B3 piece in the light green and the dark green to each side of this wedge. I pressed the seams toward the green, so away from the center, so that there would be a nice sharp point. And now we're to the point where we need to add this A4 and A4 reverse triangle. And if you look here, you can see that this is going to go on each side, each outer side, but because of the way that's going to come together, there's no way to avoid having a Y seam right here. So I was careful to use the alignment dots, and I stopped stitching 1/4 inch from the outside edge so that I will be able to pivot there. I'm going to go ahead and sew the first A4 piece onto each unit, and then I'll give you some close-ups about how to do that Y seam so that you have nice sharp points. I wanted to give you a couple of tips about adding this A4 gold piece onto the piece unit. As I mentioned, we're going to have a Y seam or a set-in seam here, and the key to successfully having those match up and have sharp points is to start sewing at the seam intersection. So 1/4 inch in if you're machine piecing from the outer edge. And my best tip for doing that involves fork pins. And you can see that I've laid the A4 piece on here along the edge of the pieced unit. And then what I'm going to do is take a straight pin, and I'm going to drop that in exactly on that alignment dot that I had marked earlier. And I'm going to push it through to the other side and find the intersection of the pieced unit, so the very point. And then I'm going to pull that pin through so it is firmly seated on top of that alignment dot. And then I'm going to take a fork pin, which is basically a pin with 2 pointy edges that have been curved around with a U shape, and it looks kind of like fork tines. And I'm going to weave that through on either side of that alignment pin. And so that's going to keep the alignment dot firmly on top of the seam intersection on the other side. Then I can pull out this straight pin, go to the sewing machine, and drop in my needle exactly on top of that dot and sew down to the end, and that's going to get me set up like this for a nice crisp dot where I can go ahead and add in the other piece. So go ahead and do that with your 4 units, add the A4 piece, and then we'll come back and do the set-in seam. So we've added the 1 A4 gold triangle to our piece unit, and you can see now clearly how we do have a Y seam here. We're going to have to sew this triangle in and intersect here at this place where the shirting and the purple come together, and we want a nice sharp point, and you can see that right now we're on track to have that. So if you're hand piecing or English paper piecing, this is relatively easy to do, but I want to show you that it is very achievable on machine as well. And so what I'm going to do is start getting this lined up, and you can hopefully see that I marked that alignment dot here. So this is where the seam line should intersect with this side where that point is, and it's 1/4 inch in from the outer edge. And so much like the previous section, I'm going to put a pin right through that alignment dot, and then I'm going to make sure that it comes through on the other side just at that seam intersection, that nice sharp point, and I want to be just to the seam side of that. And I'm going to make sure and take my time, get that lined up, and then I'm going to push the pin all the way through just like I did last time. And now line up the side, and then take one of my fork pins and drop this through on either side of that alignment pin. And it again is a reminder that helps keep the alignment dot perfectly lined up with the seam intersection, gives me stability on both sides of it. Now I will pull that alignment pin out. I'm going to put in a couple of pins. I mentioned early in the series I'm a pinner. I like to just have that security of knowing that my seam lines are all lined up for machine piecing. And now I'm going to stitch from the outer edge down here to that alignment dot. I'm going to stop the needle right on the dot. For my preference in sewing, I'll probably take 1 or 2 back stitches and come back to that dot, and then I'm going to pivot this shape and continue sewing there. And I'll show you how I do that with some series of photos just so you can see and double check how this should all work out. So I'll go ahead and pin my other units so I can sew all 4 of these at once, and then we'll get this part done and talk about putting the whole block together. Okay, so we have stitched now this first seam line, and if you open that up you can see we're really close now to being able to finish the block. And when I mention pivoting, what you do is tuck that seam allowance back so that you've got the right sides facing again, and you'll have to just fuss with this a little bit to get everything to lay down the way that you want it to. And I'm going to just kind of see which way the seams want to go. There we go. Got that evened out now. And I'm going to get a pin, and I'm going to pin this far edge first so that I have that lined up and where I'm at. And then I'm going to take this over to the machine, and I'm going to again look for my alignment dot, and that's where I'm going to want to drop the needle in. And so I will put the needle in there. It's going to line up perfectly with the seam point on the other side, and I'm going to stitch from that alignment dot out to the end here, and that will let me finish this unit. Okay, so we have successfully added the other A4 piece to all 4 of the pieced wedges, and you can see we now have a block that's really easy to sew together. It's in squares, and so I'll sew these 2 squares together and sew these 2 squares together, press the seams in opposite directions, and I will have another finished block. I'll show you the layout for the other colorway of this block, and it will go together in exactly the same way. I've now sewn together all the quadrants for block 2A. As you can see, they went together really nicely. Pressing the seams open did indeed make a big difference on this. Your block should be 12.5 inches unfinished, 12 inches finished when it's in the quilt. And then as promised, here's how the other block in this installment looks color-wise. You can see that the red stripe is a center accent, and then you've got the other pieces here. So go ahead and lay the pieces out just like we did with the first block and construct your second block. We'll be back with installment 3 to make some more blocks soon. I hope you're having fun. Feel free to contact me on any of my social media or by email if you have questions. Thanks again for joining me on Swivel.